Okay, so for project part 2, I was responsible for implementing the search functionality as well as the review functionality and also the listing of the most expensive items per category. So if I just fire up the application, it's going to take us to our home page. I'll initialize the database. I'll log in as just a regular root user. So then it brings us to the login successful page, and we have various options here. So I'm going to first start by searching for an item by category, let's say history, and then it returns all the items of that category. And so it returns the ID, the name, the price, and the seller of the item, as well as gives us various options associated with each. For me, I'll focus on the review, and I'll just review the second item, and I'll say excellent. I'll say product was great, and I'll submit that, and then you see it redirects us back to the search page. So if I go ahead and select everything from the reviews table, oops, you could see that our latest entry was the one we just made. So excellent, product was great, has our user ID, root ID of 1, item ID of 2. Just make sure it's the same item ID. So yeah, item ID of 2. So then lastly, the search most expensive items. It's just going to direct us to a page where it shows us a table of the items. Shows us the category. There's going to be one. There's only going to be one instance of each category, and the most expensive item per that category. So going into the code, we'll start with the search. So on the search page, we have our table implemented here, and it is interacting with a variable we declared in the servlet, in the control servlet. So if I bring us there, it's going to first be called here. It's going to call this search items by category function, which is here. And you can see that I created an array of items, an array list of items, and this is the item that the search page is interacting with. And it's taking the various attributes of each of those items, like get item ID, get title, yada yada yada. And here I store the category that was searched for, and here I'm storing into the items variable something that is an array list that is returned by a function that I created in items DAO, which I'll go over in a sec. After that, I basically just redirect the user back to the search page. So let's go into items DAO. And here we have that function, search items by category. I declare two array lists, one of type string, one of type items, and I call another function that's in categories DAO and store that into items. I'll go over that in a sec, but it just basically it's returning all the item IDs that are associated with the given category. So once I have that, I iterate through each of those items. I run my query where I return the item ID, title, price, and the seller ID. We're calling them the user ID. We may have to change that, but this is the seller. From the items table, where the item ID is equal to that specific ID. And so then we loop through each of those returned tuples, and for each we create a new items instance, and we set its attributes item ID, title, price, and user ID equal to the returned tuple in that specific for each loop. And then we add that item instance to the items array list that we created here. And so by the end of that, we should have various items in our items we should have various item instances in our item array list. And then here, this was, I guess, just for debugging purposes. And then we return that. We return the list of items. And in search category, so this, I'll just go over this real quick. Where is it? Categories, DL. Here we go. So that's this function. As you can see, all it does is it selects item ID from category, where category is the category that's passed. It loops through the returned tuples and adds each of the item IDs to the item array list, and then returns that. So that's the search. And then if we move on to reviews, let's go to the servlet. So that's going to be called here, and it's going to call the add review function, which is here. And so it's going to create a session, and it's going to retrieve the session ID. Or it's not creating the session; it's just retrieving the session information, including the session ID. And then basically, I'm accessing the score, which is the drop-down menu stuff, and the remark, which is the description that the user types, into these two variables. And then I'm basically passing those two variables, the user ID from the session, as well as the item ID, which I just get still again from the parameter, from the HTML parameter. I pass those four items to store review in review DAO. So if we go to review DAO, this is more or less a simple function. We just insert into the reviews table those four attributes. So we store one tuple with those four attributes, and it auto increments the review ID variable. So lastly, for the most expensive items, so if we go to the control servlet, that is called here, and it calls a search most expensive by category function, which is right here. So here I initialize my two array lists, one of type items, one of type strings. So we can start with this. So the categories, it basically just returns, it calls this get categories function in categories DAO, which essentially just returns a table of all the unique categories, no duplicates. So basically just retrieves this column, but it retrieves all the unique categories, so there's not going to be any duplicates in there. With this statement, select distinct category from categories, and it just loops through each of the query results, so each of the tuples, and stores them in categories and returns categories, which is of type array lists string. So going back to control servlet, so that's stored in categories. Then so for the most expensive items, we call a list most expensive items function in items DAO, which is here. So this was more or less quite a process. I'm pretty sure I kind of brute forced it for the most part, so I'm gonna have to go back and make it more efficient and more concise. But basically the gist is, so I've declared these two array lists, one of type items, one of type array lists, and here items organized by category. So this is the first thing I did. Basically, I wanted to get a two-dimensional array where each element of the array represents a category, and then each element in the inner array represents the items of that category. So maybe it's more clear if I go to the actual function. Items organized by category. So I have my loop, which loops through. I retrieve the individual categories, and I loop through each of the categories. And for each category, I select the item ID corresponding to that category, and I loop through that result, add it to a list of items, and then I add that list of items, which are all of the same category, to the items by category list. So then each instance of the items by category list is a set of item IDs, all part of the same category. And so once that is returned to most expensive items, oh no, not there, sorry. Once that is returned to items by category, then I loop through that array. I then have another loop that loops through each individual set of the array. And for each set, I retrieve the various attributes, item, ID, title, and price. And I basically keep track of the price, and I basically compare each price in each of those inner lists and pick the largest of the comparison. And then once I've picked the largest, I'm out of the inner loop. I create a new item instance, add the various attributes of that item, and add that new item to expensive items list. So each item that I add to expensive items list is the item that is the most expensive in its category. And then once I have completed that, I return that item, that list of items, back to my servlet. So I return that back here. And then I set these two attributes to categories and items in here. So categories, items, and I'm just getting the calling methods on them. So for items, it's um, for each. So I'm basically looping from I of 0 to the size of the categories array or the items array. Doesn't matter, they're both the same length, -1. So it's looping. So let's say we have 10 categories, it's going to be looping 10 times, and for each iteration it's going to access the various attributes of the item as well as the category, and it's going to put those all into one row. And that's basically it. That's basically it for my part.